The third rule of Drone Club is you don't talk about Drone Club. The first two are don't crash into a tree and, for the love of God, don't crash into a wedding. I was, at that precise moment, violating none of them. My drone, a sleek, carbon fiber marvel of engineering I'd christened Icarus, was behaving flawlessly. It soared 300 feet above the manicured lawns of Harmony Springs, its 4K camera capturing the kind of golden hour sunrise footage that would make a bald eagle weep with patriotic joy. Down below, my kingdom was a patchwork of offensively neutral colors: beige, taupe, greige, and the occasional daring ecru. Harmony Springs wasn't just a place, it was a color palette you'd find in a dentist's waiting room. I work from home as a software developer, which is a polite way of saying I spend 8 hours a day in my pajamas, arguing with a blinking cursor. Icarus was my escape, my eye in the sky, my way of finding beauty in the beige. My phone buzzed on the desk beside my controller. I glanced down. The name on the screen was Carol, HOA Karen. I'd added the parenthetical myself, a small act of rebellion in a world policed by bylaws. Her text message was a masterpiece of passive aggression. Leo, I see your device. I chuckled. Device? Like it was some sort of alien probe, it is hovering menacingly. I looked at the live feed on my monitor. Icarus was hovering, yes, but only menacingly if you were a dandelion with a death wish. This is a violation of Section 7, Subsection B, Paragraph 4, Aesthetic Disruption. I typed back a quick, cheerful reply. Morning, Carol. Just capturing the sunrise. It's spectacular today. Good for property values. The 3 little dots appeared and disappeared for a full minute. She was composing her magnum opus of fury. I imagined her, standing on her porch in a silk robe, her perfectly coiffed helmet of blonde hair immobile against the morning breeze, stabbing at her phone screen with a manicured finger. The buzz that followed was longer, more insistent. A photo came through. It was a blurry shot of my drone, a tiny black speck against the vast orange-streaked sky. Below it, a caption that dripped with indignation. I have documentary evidence of your unauthorized aerial surveillance. Expect a formal citation. I sighed. It was the 3rd one this month. The first had been for my lawn being a 1/4 inch too high. The second was for a non-standard mailbox, which was just a regular mailbox I'd painted dark blue. The woman had a pathological aversion to primary colors. 10 minutes later, my doorbell rang. Not a friendly, neighborly ring. It was a sharp, insistent jab, the kind that says, "I know you're in there, you miscreant." I peered through the peephole. There she was, in the flesh. She'd traded the robe for a crisp beige pantsuit. In her hand, she clutched a piece of paper like it was the Dead Sea Scrolls. I took a deep breath, pasted on a pleasant smile, and opened the door. "Carol, what a surprise," I said, my voice dripping with false cheer. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice as tight as her facelift. She didn't acknowledge my greeting. She just thrust the paper at my chest. "Your official notice." I took it. The paper was still warm from the printer. The charge was even better up close. Unauthorized aerial surveillance and aesthetic disruption. Aesthetic disruption? I repeated, letting a note of genuine puzzlement enter my voice. "Carol, it's a sunrise. It's the original aesthetic. The OG, if you will." Her eyes narrowed. "Your device creates a discordant visual element against the carefully curated skyscape of our community, and it makes a whirring sound." "It's electric," I said. "It whirs. It's quieter than Mr. Henderson's leaf blower, and he's been at it since 6 a.m. "Mr. Henderson's horticultural activities are approved by the board," she snapped. Your spying is not. She leaned in, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. I have a right to privacy, Mr. Vance. My prize-winning petunias have a right to not be filmed in their most vulnerable state. I stared at her for a beat, letting the sheer absurdity of the statement wash over me. I wanted to tell her that my drone had a camera that could probably read the brand name on her hairspray from 300 feet, but that I was far more interested in the architectural symmetry of the cul-de-sac. I wanted to explain that the only thing I was surveilling was the slow, creeping existential dread of suburban life. But I didn't. Instead, I gave her my most accommodating smile. Carol, with all due respect, I assure you, Icarus is programmed to ignore all flora of the petunia genus. It finds them dreadfully common. Her face, a carefully constructed mask of suburban outrage, twitched. I had managed to offend her on behalf of her flowers. It was a new low, or a new high, depending on your perspective. This is your final warning, she hissed, jabbing a finger toward the citation in my hand. The next call I make will be to the authorities. She spun on her sensible beige heel and marched back down my driveway, her back ramrod straight. I watched her go, a small, furious woman on a crusade against a piece of plastic and a set of rotors. I looked down at the citation, then up at the sky where my drone still hung, a silent, solitary speck in the morning light. The war had begun, and I had a feeling the whirring was about to get a lot louder. A few days later, the first casualty of the drone wars arrived in a dusty pickup truck. His name was Dave. He was a contractor, a man whose face looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the sun for a few decades. He was here to build me a deck, a project I'd been putting off for years, but now felt was a necessary act of defiance. A deck was a permanent, non-flying, and decidedly beige-adjacent middle finger to the HOA. So, this is the spot, he said, surveying my backyard with a critical eye. His voice was a low rumble, like gravel being poured into a bucket. This is it, I confirmed. I'm thinking something in cedar, a nice, warm, reddish-brown, a color found in nature. I gave him a wink. He didn't return it. We were looking at blueprints when a shadow fell over us. I didn't need to turn around. I could feel the precipitous drop in atmospheric joy. Mr. Vance. It was Karen, of course. She'd materialized at my property line, clipboard in hand. She looked like a scientist who'd just discovered a new, particularly loathsome species of insect. Carol, I said, turning slowly. To what do we owe the pleasure? I was reviewing the morning's activity reports, she said, as if she were the head of a small intelligence agency, and I noticed a work vehicle parked outside your residence. According to Section 12, subsection D, all major construction projects must be pre-approved by the Architectural Review Committee. Dave let out a slow, deliberate sigh. It was the sound of a man who had dealt with 1,000 Karens in his lifetime. Ma'am, he said, his voice sandpaper rough. I'm here to give an estimate. There's no construction yet. Karen's eyes flicked to him, dismissing him as little more than a talking tool belt. And who might you be? Dave, he said. Just Dave. No last name, no company. Just a solid, two-syllable declaration of existence. She turned her attention back to me, holding up the clipboard. I'll need to see your plans. The bylaws written in 1998 are very specific about excessive woodwork. Excessive woodwork? I repeated, dumbfounded. We're in a forest. The houses are made of wood. What constitutes excessive? That, she said with an air of finality, is for the committee to decide. She stood there, expectant, as if I were going to hand over my deck-based dreams for her to crush under the heel of her beige loafer. Dave finally broke the silence. "Look, lady," he said, pulling a crumpled piece of paper and a pencil from his pocket. "Here's the plan." He scribbled for a moment. "It's gonna be a rectangle. Made of wood, people are gonna sit on it." He handed the paper to her. "There, submitted." For a moment, I thought Karen's head might actually explode. Her face went through a series of micro-expressions: disbelief, fury, and then a strange, almost impressed flicker of shock at his audacity. She snatched the paper from his hand, gave it a disdainful look, and then glared at me. "I'll be in touch," she said, her voice a low threat. She spun and marched away, the clipboard her shield and scepter. Dave watched her go, a slow smile spreading across his rugged face. He turned back to me. "You know," he said, "I built a panic room for a guy once. Less paperwork." "Do you give a friends and family discount?" I asked. "Because I think my neighbor is a C-list supervillain." He chuckled, a real, genuine sound that seemed out of place in the sterile environment of Harmony Springs. "Nah, she's just bored. Give a person a little bit of power in a place this quiet, they'll turn into a tyrant just to have something to do." He clapped me on the shoulder. "Don't worry about her. I'll handle the permits. You just worry about your—" What did she call it? Your device. Over the next few days, Dave became a permanent fixture in my backyard. The rhythmic sound of his saw and hammer was a welcome replacement for the oppressive silence. He also became my unwilling audience. He was there when Karen sent an official letter demanding to know the species of every plant I intended to put on the deck. He was there when she measured the distance from my grill to the fence, citing a fire code violation. He'd just shake his head, take a sip of his lukewarm coffee from a battered thermos, and offer his dry commentary. "You know, for a guy who works in his pajamas," he said one afternoon, after a particularly lengthy tirade from Karen about the reflective glare from my new bug zapper, "you've got a real knack for making powerful enemies." "It's a gift," I said, watching Karen retreat. "I'm thinking of monetizing it." The deck was starting to take shape. It was beautiful, a rich reddish cedar rectangle of glorious rebellion. And every time I looked at it, I felt a surge of petty triumph. But I knew it wasn't enough. Karen was a creature of escalation, and I had a feeling her next move would involve more than just a clipboard. The weekend arrived, and with it, a new toy for Icarus. I'd ordered a small, surprisingly powerful speaker that attached to the drone's undercarriage. My intentions were, I told myself, purely scientific. I wanted to test the audio projection capabilities at various altitudes. Of course, the fact that Karen was hosting her quarterly HOA garden party was a complete coincidence. I waited until her backyard was filled with the beige-clad denizens of Harmony Springs. They were milling about, sipping iced tea and making polite conversation about mulch. It was a scene of such profound, soul-crushing boredom that I felt I had a civic duty to intervene. I launched Icarus from my new, unapproved deck. It ascended silently, a black predator against the bright blue afternoon sky. I hovered it directly over my own property, well within my rights, but just high enough to have a clear line of sound. And then I pressed play. The opening synthesizer chords of Kenny Loggins' Danger Zone blasted from the sky. It wasn't just loud, it was divinely, absurdly loud. I watched on my monitor as a dozen perfectly coiffed heads snapped upward in unison. Faces registered confusion, then annoyance. A man in a pastel polo shirt dropped his cucumber sandwich. I let it play for a solid minute, a glorious 80s-drenched minute of pure, unadulterated chaos. I imagined myself as a rogue fighter pilot, a maverick of the suburbs. Then, just as the guitar solo kicked in, I cut the music and brought Icarus home. Mission accomplished. The aftermath was even better than I'd hoped. I didn't hear from Karen directly. She was too smart for that. Instead, about an hour later, a police car pulled up to my curb. I watched from my window as Officer Miller unfolded himself from the driver's seat. He moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who was being paid by the hour and intended to take every last second of it. He adjusted his belt, sighed heavily, and started the long walk up my driveway. I met him at the door. "Afternoon, officer," I said, leaning against the doorframe with a casualness I definitely did not feel. "Vance," he said. He didn't say my name like a question. He said it like a diagnosis. "We need to talk." He followed me into the living room. He didn't sit. He just stood in the center of the room, his presence sucking all the oxygen out of the air. "I just came from your neighbor's house," he began, his voice flat. "Carol Peterson. She seems to be under the impression that she was the victim of an aerial assault." "An assault?" I asked, feigning shock. "Is everyone okay?" Miller's eyes were tired. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too many lost cats, too many teenagers with fake IDs, and far, far too many HOA disputes. "She claims you used a remote-controlled aircraft to blast rock and roll music at her garden party." "That's a wild accusation," I said, shaking my head in disbelief. "Is it?" he asked. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen and a tinny but unmistakable sound filled the room. It was the theme from Top Gun. My Top Gun. He'd recorded it. I was caught. But I wasn't going down without a fight. "Okay," I conceded. "First, it was Mighty Wings, not Danger Zone." A subtle but important distinction for any Kenny Loggins aficionado. Get your facts right. Second, that was a preliminary test of a new auditory wildlife deterrent system I'm developing. Miller stared at me. His expression didn't change. "A wildlife deterrent system." "Exactly," I said, warming to my theme. "The specific frequency of 80s movie anthems has been shown to be deeply unsettling to squirrels and other garden pests. I was surveying my lawn for a potential weed infestation, for the good of the community, you understand." He continued to stare. A long, painful silence stretched between us. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. I could hear Dave hammering on the deck outside. Finally, he spoke. "Sir, did you or did you not use a remote-controlled aircraft to play Mighty Wings at an unreasonable volume with the intent of disrupting your neighbor's social gathering?" I deflated. "The volume may have been slightly miscalibrated," I admitted. He nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." He put his phone away. He looked at me, then gestured vaguely in the direction of Karen's house. "Look, you and I both know she's particular. We get calls about her at least once a month. The recycling bins aren't aligned, someone's wind chimes are disharmonious, you name it." A flicker of hope ignited within me. An ally? "But," he continued, and the flicker died, "you're not helping. You're pouring gasoline on a fire, a very, very beige fire." He walked to the door. "So, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to go back to my car, and I'm going to write in my report that I delivered a stern warning to both parties to play nice. And you are going to stop using your drone to reenact scenes from 80s action movies. Are we clear?" "Crystal," I said. He opened the door to leave, then paused and looked back at me. There was a glimmer of something in his eye. It might have been amusement. It might have been pity. "And Vance?" "Yes, officer?" "It was definitely Danger Zone." He left. I stood in my living room, the faint echo of synth pop still hanging in the air. I had won the battle, but the war was far from over, and Karen, I knew, was already planning her next attack. The following week was quiet, too quiet. There were no violation notices, no angry texts, no clipboard-wielding ambushes. Karen was observing me from a distance, her curtains twitching whenever I stepped outside. It was the suburban equivalent of a Cold War standoff. I used the time to refine my craft. I started a YouTube channel called Harmony from Above. I posted sweeping cinematic videos of the town, set to peaceful orchestral music. I filmed the sun glinting off the creek, the deer grazing in the woods behind the development, the geometric perfection of the cul-de-sacs. The videos were a hit. People I'd never spoken to were stopping me in the grocery store to tell me how much they loved them. "You make our town look like something out of a movie," one neighbor gushed. I was becoming a local hero, and I knew, with every fiber of my being, that this was driving Karen insane. The inevitable confrontation came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my driveway collecting a package when her car glided to a silent stop at the curb. The window whispered down. "Leo," she said. She used my first name. The situation had just become critical. "Carol," I replied, matching her tone. "Your videos are causing quite a stir," she said. It wasn't a compliment. "People seem to enjoy them," I said with a shrug. "It's nice to see our neighborhood from a different perspective, don't you think?" "I think," she said, her voice dropping to a low, venomous purr, "that you are a menace. You lull people into a false sense of security with your pretty pictures, but I know what you are. A voyeur. A spy." "A filmmaker," I corrected gently. She ignored me. "I've done my research, Leo. I've been on the phone with the Federal Aviation Administration." She said each word with a slow, deliberate emphasis, as if she were summoning a demon from the depths of bureaucratic hell. For all I knew, she was. "The FAA," she repeated, savoring the acronym. "They have very strict rules about unmanned aerial vehicles, rules about registration, about flight paths, about commercial use. They are very interested to hear about your little YouTube channel, very interested indeed." She was playing her trump card. This wasn't a petty bylaw dispute anymore. This was federal. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but inside, a small, cold knot of dread was forming. I followed the rules. I always flew safely, but the FAA was a faceless, powerful entity. A complaint from a determined citizen, no matter how unhinged, could ground me for good. "You're playing with fire, Leo," she said, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. "The only thing on fire is your desperate need for control, Carol," I muttered under my breath as she drove away. She had made her move. The ball was in my court. But for the first time in our long, ridiculous war, I wasn't sure what my next play should be. I stood in my driveway, the package forgotten in my hand, and stared up at the empty sky. The silence felt different now. It felt like a warning. It happened on a Tuesday. Tuesdays are supposed to be boring. They're the beige of weekdays, a bland, unremarkable stretch of time between the memory of the weekend and the promise of Friday. This Tuesday, however, had other plans. I was in my home office, deep in the hypnotic rhythm of coding. The window was open, and the steady, reassuring sound of Dave's nail gun punctuated the afternoon quiet. He was putting the finishing touches on the deck, a monument to my defiance that was now, ironically, the most committee-approved structure on the block. He'd worn Karen down with sheer, grizzled persistence. The first sign that the universe was about to come off its hinges was a low, deep rumble. It wasn't a sound so much as a feeling, a vibration that started in the soles of my feet and worked its way up my spine. My first thought was that a very large truck was passing by. Then my monitor shuddered. The rumble grew into a roar, a violent, guttural noise that seemed to come from the very core of the earth. The house gave a sudden, sickening lurch to the left. A framed photo of my parents slid off my desk and shattered on the floor. Outside, the rhythmic pop-pop-pop of the nail gun stopped. "Dave!" I yelled, grabbing the edge of my desk as the floor began to buck and roll like the deck of a ship in a storm. The roar intensified. It was the sound of 1,000 freight trains derailing at once. My bookshelf vomited its contents across the room. Cracks snaked across the drywall like lightning. This wasn't an earthquake. This was the end of the world, starting in my home office. I dove under my desk, curling into a ball as the house groaned and protested around me. The noise was deafening, the motion relentless. I could hear the shattering of glass, the splintering of wood, the horrifying shriek of tortured metal. My mind, in a weird act of self-preservation, retreated into sarcasm. Well, so much for the security deposit. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. It was a dead, absolute silence, punctuated by the faint, distant tinkling of a single, unbroken wind chime. I crawled out from under the desk. My office was a disaster zone. The power was out. I stumbled to the window and looked out. The perfect, manicured world of Harmony Springs was gone. My neighbor's chimney had collapsed, leaving a gaping hole in their roof. The street was buckled and cracked. A car alarm bleated hysterically somewhere down the block. "Dave!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. "Are you okay?" I ran to the back door and threw it open. Dave was on his hands and knees on the new deck. He was pale but seemed unhurt. The deck itself, my beautiful cedar rebellion, was intact. Dave built things to last. "What the hell was that?" he breathed, pushing himself to his feet. "I think the planet just hiccuped," I said, my heart still hammering against my ribs. My first thought was my family. My parents and my sister lived across town. I grabbed my phone. No signal. Of course. The landline was dead too. We were cut off. A wave of panic, cold and sharp, washed over me. I had no way of knowing if they were safe. No way of knowing how bad this really was. And then my eyes fell on the hard shell case in the corner of the room. The case with the stenciled letters. Icarus. I had a way to see. "You sure that thing can fly in this?" Dave asked, watching as I fumbled with the drone's battery pack. My hands were shaking. "It's a $4,000 piece of equipment, Dave," I said, my voice tight. "It can fly through a hurricane. Today it gets to prove it." The power was out, but my car was a glorified generator on wheels. I ran a power inverter from the cigarette lighter, plugged in my controller and monitor, and brought the system to life. The familiar whir of Icarus's startup sequence was the most comforting sound I'd ever heard. I carried the drone out to the middle of the lawn, the grass littered with roof shingles and debris. I took a deep breath, centered the controls, and pushed the throttle forward. Icarus ascended, its 4 rotors biting into the still, heavy air. It climbed 50 feet, 100, 200. It was a tiny black cross against a sky that was now hazy with dust and smoke. I looked down at the monitor, at the God's eye view it provided, and my breath caught in my throat. It was worse. So much worse than I could have imagined. The neat, orderly grid of Harmony Springs was a chaotic mess of destruction. Houses were pancaked. A water main had burst, creating a muddy, churning river where a street used to be. In the distance, a plume of thick, black smoke coiled into the sky from the direction of the town center. But it was the main highway that made my blood run cold. The overpass, the one I took every time I visited my parents, was gone. Not damaged, gone. A huge section of it had simply collapsed. A tangle of concrete and rebar lying in a heap across the lanes below. "Oh my God," Dave whispered, staring over my shoulder at the screen. I was frozen, my mind racing, my family. The collapsed bridge. The route to their house was cut off. I had to see more. I pushed the controls forward, sending Icarus soaring towards the town center. The drone's camera fed me a silent, horrifying movie of the devastation. It was methodical, clinical. It showed me a world that had been normal 20 minutes ago and was now broken. The library's roof had caved in. The steeple of the old church had toppled. The grocery store parking lot was a jumble of overturned cars. It was too much. The scale of it was overwhelming. I felt a wave of helplessness wash over me. I was just one guy with a glorified toy. What could I possibly do? And then I saw it. On the roof of a one-story house near the flooded creek, two figures were waving their arms frantically. I zoomed in. It was an elderly couple. I recognized them from my walks around the neighborhood. The Hendersons. Their house was surrounded by a torrent of brown, swirling water. The lower floor was completely submerged. They were trapped. Without thinking, I flipped a switch on my controller, activating the speaker. I flew Icarus closer, hovering about 50 feet above them. "Mr. Henderson!" I yelled into the controller's microphone. My voice, tinny and amplified, blasted from the drone. "Can you hear me? Don't move! Help is on the way!" The couple stopped waving and stared up at the drone, their faces a mixture of terror and disbelief. Mr. Henderson gave a weak thumbs up. My mind was suddenly clear. The helplessness was gone, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. I had a purpose. I scanned the area with the drone's camera. A few blocks away, I spotted a fire truck, its lights flashing uselessly. It was trying to navigate a street that was choked with debris from a collapsed wall. They were blocked. They couldn't see the Hendersons. But I could. I brought up the patchy Wi-Fi signal I was getting from a neighbor's solar-powered generator. It was slow, but it worked. I dialed 911. After an agonizingly long series of rings, a harried voice answered. 911, what's your emergency? My name is Leo Vance, I said, speaking quickly and clearly. I'm operating a drone over Harmony Springs. I have eyes on a fire truck on Elm Street, blocked by debris. I also have eyes on an elderly couple trapped on their roof at 124 Willow Creek Lane. The fire truck is less than a quarter-mile away from them. I can guide them in. There was a pause on the other end. A drone? Yes, I said, my patience fraying. A flying camera. Do you want my help or not? Another pause, then, stand by. I watched the screen, my knuckles white on the controller. I guided Icarus back toward the fire truck. I could see the firefighters outside their vehicle, looking lost. The dispatcher came back on the line. Okay, drone operator. The captain of Engine 4 can hear you on his radio. Talk him in. I took a deep breath. Engine 4, this is civilian aerial support. Do you copy? A crackle of static, then a new voice, deep and calm, came through my phone's speaker. We copy, Aerial. Where are we going? And just like that, I was in the rescue business. For the next 10 minutes, I was the firefighter's eye in the sky. Okay, Engine 4, you're going to want to reverse about 50 feet. There's an alleyway to your left. It looks clear. Take it to the end. Make a right on Oak Avenue. I watched as the huge truck followed my instructions, a lumbering red giant in a shattered world. The street ahead is flooded, I reported, but it looks passable for you. The house is the third on the left, blue shutters, or what's left of them. I hovered Icarus over the Hendersons' house as the fire truck rolled up. I watched as the firefighters, my firefighters, deployed a ladder and helped the terrified couple down. I had done it. My toy, my nuisance, my instrument of petty revenge had just saved 2 lives. A wave of euphoria washed over me. I was so engrossed in the screen, so focused on the small victory, that I didn't hear the car pull up in front of my house. I didn't hear the car doors open. The first I knew of their presence was a loud, official-sounding knock on my front door. "Just a second!" I yelled, my eyes still glued to the monitor. I was already scanning for my next point of interest, my mind buzzing. The dispatcher was still on the line, asking if I could get a look at the state of the local hospital. The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. It was the kind of knock that doesn't take just a second for an answer. "Dave, can you get that?" I shouted, my focus entirely on guiding Icarus through the smoky haze. "A little busy here, kid," he yelled back. He was trying to rig a tarp over a broken window. With a groan of frustration, I put the 911 dispatcher on hold and jogged to the door, my controller still clutched in my hand. I was annoyed, distracted, and completely unprepared for what was on the other side. I threw the door open. Standing on my porch were two people, a man and a woman. They were wearing identical navy blue jackets with yellow letters stitched over the breast. FAA. My blood ran cold. It was them. The demons Karen had threatened to summon. They were real. And they were on my doorstep. The man was tall and severe, with a jaw that looked like it could crack walnuts. The woman was shorter, with sharp, intelligent eyes that were already scanning me, my house, my controller, with a kind of forensic intensity. "Leonard Vance?" the woman said. Her voice was crisp, no nonsense. She was Agent Reynolds. I knew it instantly. My brain, which had been performing so brilliantly just moments before, decided to short-circuit. The only response I could muster was a weak, idiotic squeak. "Depends," I finally managed, my voice an octave higher than usual. "If you're selling something, he's not home. If you're here about the earthquake, get in line." Agent Reynolds was not amused. She held up a badge. "I'm Agent Reynolds, Federal Aviation Administration. This is Agent Michaels. We've received a complaint about the unauthorized operation of an unmanned aerial vehicle in this airspace." The timing was so exquisitely, so biblically, so comically awful that a bubble of hysterical laughter escaped my lips. I couldn't help it. The world was ending, and the drone police had arrived to write me a ticket. "A complaint?" I said, the laughter turning into a gasp for air. "Ma'am, with all due respect, the airspace is the least of our problems right now. Unauthorized operation? The only thing unauthorized around here is the tectonic plate that just tried to redesign the entire state." Agent Michaels, the silent jaw-cracker, took a step forward. "Sir, we need you to ground your vehicle immediately. This is a restricted flight zone." "Restricted?" I stared at him, my disbelief overriding my fear. I held up the controller, pointing at the small screen where Icarus was still transmitting a live feed of the chaos downtown. "Look at this. Just take a look." I tilted the screen towards them. The image was grainy, but clear. It showed a group of people huddled on the roof of a partially collapsed office building, waving frantically at my drone. "You want me to ground this? Fine," I said, my voice rising. "But first, you tell them. You tell those people on that roof that I have to stop because someone's great-aunt Carol got her panties in a twist about her petunias. You tell them the FAA says they have to wait." I stabbed a finger at the screen. "I'm a little busy preventing this entire town from becoming a statistic. Now, do you want to write me a ticket, or do you want to help me find a missing kid near the collapsed overpass?" The two agents stared at the screen. The bluster and authority seemed to drain from their faces, replaced by a shared look of shock. They were field agents. They were used to dealing with reckless hobbyists and clueless YouTubers. They were not prepared for this. Agent Reynolds was the first to recover. Her sharp eyes flicked from the screen, to me, to the sky, and back to the screen. I could see the gears turning in her head, the by-the-book training warring with the reality of the situation unfolding on my controller. She pulled out her phone. It was a satellite phone. Of course it was. "Get me the regional director," she said into the phone, her voice all business again. "Now!" She held my gaze as she waited, her expression unreadable. I stood in my doorway, my drone still in the air, my fate hanging in the balance, as the world fell apart around us. Agent Reynolds's side of the conversation was short, clipped, and full of acronyms I didn't understand. She spoke with an unnerving calm, relaying the situation on the ground and in the air with brisk efficiency. She described my drone not as a device or a vehicle, but as an active aerial asset. She described me not as a suspect, but as the asset's operator. When she was finished, she listened for a long time, her eyes never leaving my face. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Agent Michaels stood beside her, his arms crossed, a granite statue of federal authority. David stopped working and was now unabashedly listening from the living room. Finally, she clicked the phone off and slid it back into her jacket pocket. She took a deep breath, the kind you take before you jump into very cold water. "Mr. Vance," she said, and her tone had changed. The hard edge of suspicion was gone, replaced by something that sounded suspiciously like respect. "Due to the exigent circumstances, the collapse of local infrastructure, and your unique qualifications." She paused, as if the words tasted strange in her mouth. "Effective immediately, the Federal Aviation Administration is formally commandeering your services. You are now the acting civilian aerial reconnaissance coordinator for this disaster zone. You'll report directly to me." I stared at her. I was sure I had misheard. The earthquake must have rattled my brain loose. "I'm sorry, the what now?" "You're in charge of the eyes in the sky," she clarified. "You just got a promotion." A slow grin spread across Dave's face. He shook his head and let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, walking back toward the kitchen. "Kid goes from public enemy #1 to running the whole show. You want a coffee, boss?" Before I could answer, another figure appeared at my open door. It was Officer Miller. He looked exhausted, his uniform smudged with dirt, but his eyes were sharp. He took in the scene, me, the two FAA agents, the controlled chaos of my living room, and raised an eyebrow. "Vance," he said, "I was starting to think you were behind all this." Agent Reynolds stepped forward and quickly briefed him on my new, absurd job title. Miller listened, his expression shifting from weariness to surprise, and then to a kind of grudging acceptance. "All right," he said, nodding. "We've got no eyes. Communications are a mess. If he can see what's going on, we need him." He looked at me. "Consider me your law enforcement liaison. You find people who need help, I'll get our guys to them." And just like that, my living room, the place where I normally sat in my bathrobe and played video games, had become a multi-agency command center. My coffee table was now a strategy hub. Dave, bless his heart, had found my stash of power strips and was setting up a charging station. Agent Reynolds had her maps spread out on my dining room table. Officer Miller was on his police radio, relaying my new official status. I was at the center of it all, still clutching my controller, feeling like I'd been dropped into a movie I hadn't auditioned for. The weight of it all, the sheer terrifying responsibility started to sink in. "Okay," I said, taking a deep breath and turning back to my monitor. "Let's get to work." The next few hours were a blur. The world shrank to the size of my monitor, a 10-inch window into a city in agony. I was no longer Leo Vance, sarcastic coder and drone enthusiast. I was coordinator, a disembodied voice from the sky, a digital ghost guiding the living through the ruins. The work was relentless. I guided a team of paramedics through a maze of back alleys to reach a man who'd had a heart attack. I used Icarus's thermal camera to find a small child who had been hiding, terrified, in the wreckage of a collapsed shed, directing her frantic parents to the exact spot. I flew over the hospital, confirming for Agent Reynolds that while the main building was damaged, the emergency wing was intact and accessible from the south. Each small success was a shot of adrenaline, pushing back the exhaustion and the horror. It was during a brief lull, while Icarus's battery was recharging, that Dave motioned me over to his tablet, which he'd managed to get connected to a spotty cellular signal. "You might want to see this," he said, a grin playing on his lips. He showed me a live news broadcast. A reporter was standing in front of the local high school, which had been turned into an emergency shelter. The camera panned across the crowd of displaced residents, their faces smudged with dirt and etched with worry. And then the reporter zeroed in on a familiar figure. It was Karen. Her beige pantsuit was rumpled and stained. Her helmet of hair was, for the first time since I'd known her, in complete disarray. A single defiant strand stuck straight up from the crown of her head. She looked lost, stripped of her authority and her perfectly manicured world. The reporter, a young woman with a microphone, approached her. "Ma'am, you're a resident of this area. Can you tell us what you saw?" Karen's eyes lit up. This was her chance, a camera, an audience. She drew herself up to her full height. "It was chaos," she began, her voice quivering with theatrical emotion. "But the real danger, the real menace, wasn't the earthquake. It's the drones." The reporter looked confused. "The drones?" "Yes," Karen insisted, her voice rising. "There's a man in my neighborhood, a reckless amateur who flies his device at all hours, spying on us, blasting his noise. He's a menace to society. He's probably the reason the authorities are having so much trouble. He's clogging up the sky." I watched, mesmerized. Even in the midst of an apocalypse, her one-track mind was chugging along its well-worn path of petty grievance. The reporter, however, was already distracted. Someone was speaking into her earpiece. Her expression changed. "Thank you for your colorful commentary, ma'am," she said dismissively, already turning away from Karen. "We have a breaking update. We're getting reports of a heroic mystery drone pilot who has been instrumental in coordinating rescue efforts across the city, saving dozens of lives. Officials are calling this pilot an invaluable asset." The camera cut away, leaving Karen standing alone, her mouth half open, her moment of televised glory snatched away and replaced by the story of my triumph. The look on her face was a spectacular collage of confusion, rage, and utter crushing defeat. I didn't feel a surge of victory. I didn't feel smug. Watching her stand there, so small and irrelevant in the face of real tragedy, I just felt a strange, quiet pity. The war was over, and nobody had really won. 2 weeks later, the world was starting to look like itself again, but in a bruised and battered way. The initial frantic chaos had subsided into the slow, grinding work of recovery. My title of coordinator had been retired, but my life had been irrevocably changed. My YouTube channel had 1 million new subscribers, and I'd had to politely decline 3 separate book deals and a truly bizarre offer to be the face of a new line of rescue-ready recreational drones. I was sitting on my deck, my beautiful, sturdy, and now famous deck, with Dave. The last of the repairs to my house were done. The sun was setting, casting a warm, orange glow over a neighborhood that was slowly stitching itself back together. We were sharing a beer, the silence comfortable and earned. "So, emergency management consultant," Dave said, taking a sip. "Fancy." I shrugged. "It's mostly just me telling them to buy more batteries and a better coffee machine. But it's a job." It was more than that. It was a purpose. I'd found something in the chaos, a part of myself I never knew existed. The sarcasm and the detachment were still there, my brain's default settings, but they were now balanced by something else. A sense of connection to this place, to these people. I saw movement at the end of my driveway. It was Karen. She was retrieving her mail, moving with a slowness I'd never seen in her before. She saw me watching her. I expected the usual glare, the tightening of the lips. Instead, she just stood there for a moment. Then, she gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a truce. It was just an acknowledgement. A recognition that the world was bigger than her bylaws and my drone. I nodded back. She turned and retreated into her house, and I knew I'd never get another violation notice again. The next month was a blur of a new kind of normal. I spent my days flying Icarus 2.0, a brand new top-of-the-line model gifted to me by a grateful tech company over the town. I wasn't chasing sunrises anymore. I was mapping fault lines for geologists, inspecting damaged infrastructure for city planners, and creating detailed 3D models of the recovery efforts. I was in my office, guiding Icarus over the public library, when my phone rang. The caller ID said Officer Miller. I smiled and answered. "Don't tell me," I said. "Another cat up a tree?" There was a chuckle on the other end. "Worse. Mrs. Higgins' prized poodle, Fifi, has somehow gotten herself onto the roof of the courthouse. The fire department says the ladder truck is still out for repairs from the... you know." I looked at my controller, at the live feed from Icarus 2.0 soaring high above the town. The drone felt like an extension of myself now. "What's the altitude and wind speed, Miller?" I asked. "You're a real hero. You know that?" he said, a genuine warmth in his voice. I leaned back in my chair, a feeling of profound, unexpected contentment washing over me. "Nah," I said, maneuvering Icarus into a gentle turn towards the courthouse. "I'm just a guy with a drone." I paused, a small smile playing on my lips as I thought of the woman in the beige house across the street. "And a very nosy neighbor to thank for it,"